Morning, everyone. I'm Diogo. I am a geographer and historian, I suppose, of Latin America and from Latin America. And this is me struggling with the interdisciplinarity that Erica was talking about yesterday, and I won't be forgetting it anytime soon. Do not worry, especially because I can't do anything that is not really um, interdisciplinary. But anyway, so there seems to be a consensus about the central role of landscape in modern human and most species studies. However, there has been relatively little engagement with the historically more recent but no less famous concept of cultural landscape, which is surprising given its increasing use in conservation policy, right? So can cultural landscapes be rethought from a multi-species lens? What would this entail for the concept of culture itself? So in this paper, I'll try to explore these questions by putting Carl Sauer's classic theory of cultural landscape in dialogue with Amerindian indigenous philosophies, ecosemiotics, and other approaches. By preserving Sauer's focus on phenomenology while doing away or trying to do away with his anthropocentric visualism, I'll propose the concept of multi-species cultural landscape. Its central claim is that multi-species coexistence requires people to negotiate the meaning of shared environmental objects and features with diversely bodied creatures, thus generating interspecies multi-ontological practices that materialize as spatial arrangements. I'll articulate this concept based on an empirical account, namely the landscapes created by human leafcutter and relations in 19th and 20th century Brazil. So, although several authors had been groping for the notion of cultural landscape for quite some time, it was the American geographer Carl Sauer who synthesized the then existing insights, especially from the German written literature, into a robust concept in the early 20th century. In his 1925 classic The Morphology of Landscape, Sauer laid out the conceptual framework for studying the cultural landscape, which he defined as, I'm quoting, a landscape in which the process of shaping is by no means thought of as simply physical. The cultural landscape is fashioned from a natural landscape by a culture group. Culture is the agent, the natural area is the medium, the cultural landscape, the result. End of quote. So breaking with the environmental determinism still in vogue at the time, Sauer strongly emphasized the creative capabilities of people vis-a-vis the non-human world. In his view, the importance of nature was limited to the role of raw material. The physical natural attributes that mattered analytically were those significant to humans, who Sauer considered to be the only true appraisers and sculptors of the world. The key here, of course, is the supposed power of the intellect, which Sauer saw as uniquely human. Men alone ate the fruit of the tree of knowledge and thereby began to acquire and transmit learning or culture. Sauer wrote in a later volume on domestication. I'm quoting again. An environment can only be described in terms of the knowledge and preferences of the occupying persons. End of quote. So, okay, what if we took persons in the Amerindian sense rather than the modern Western one? Appending modern logic, Amerindian perspectivist cosmologists make culture the universal reality, while nature, or the material objectivity of bodies, becomes the realm of the particular. Each being participates in culture in a particular way, determined by species-specific sensory capabilities that shape their phenomenal world. Geographers, historians, anthropologists, philosophers, and other environmental humanists have been calling attention to how even the most heavily human-shaped landscapes can be resignified and repurposed by other species according to their own needs and dispositions. Drawing on these and other insights, I'll now try to outline the concept of multi-species cultural landscape with the help of an empirical account of human ant relations in Southeast Brazil in the 19th and early 20th century. So this is trying to sketch the area I'm mostly interested in. So while researching the Kew Gardens Library a few years ago, I came across this 1894 booklet about the nests of the famous Saúva, the Atta ants, widely considered one of the major agricultural pests in Latin America. It was authored by this guy called Antônio Gomes de Azevedo Sampaio, a Portuguese-born writer and naturalist who migrated to Brazil as a teenager, settling in São Paulo's Paraíba Valley, pretty much this area here, in the 1860s, right? The last quarter of his life, he dedicated himself passionately to studying the Atta ants, the Saúva ants, which he considered, I'm quoting, one of the most important links in the scale, end of quote, of life on Earth, second only to humans in terms of intelligence. Azevedo Sampaio reported having collected most of his evidence from this, I'm quoting, extensive orchard owned by a septuagenarian lady who was, I'm quoting, bold, singular, tenacious. Like the ants, she fought daily on her small farm. Relying on the meager income from a few orange, lemon, and coffee trees, this unnamed lady lived in a conflicting and hateful symbiosis with the ants. She lives alone, speaks alone, wrote Azevedo Sampaio. I'm quoting again, her limited vocabulary consisting of cursing the ants, end of quote. Over a lifelong conviviality, the woman had become a model of her insect opponent, someone who had fixed an idea, that of, I'm quoting, dying embracing her, the ant, going beyond the grave, a living phonograph of complaints and diatribes, end of quote. The lady would walk up and down her small farm all day long, holding parcels to clog and tamp down the anthill's entrances. Once, while talking to Azevedo Sampaio, she left a stick leaning against a fence around the chicken coop. She ended up forgetting it there while going to take care of something else. But Azevedo Sampaio noticed it, witnessing the stick being quickly perceived by a group of forager ants trying to reach a bush adjacent to the fence. They had remained hesitant because of the fenced birds, the fenced predators there. However, because the way the stick had been positioned, the ants found a bridge to the bush, right, safely away from the chickens. Come and see, exclaimed Azevedo Sampaio almost sadistically. Come and see how much you love your associates, that you even provide them with passages so they can more easily share your crop. See how clever they are, the old lady replied. How one is supposed to have orchards in this way? End of quote. So this anecdote summarizes well the larger scale relationship between the ants and the non-indigenous or mestizo humans during Brazil's post-independence agricultural expansion. The ants live on a fungus they grow in underground nests using a sort of compost made up of macerated leaves, flowers, and other plant parts extracted from overground vegetation. The forager ants that do this harvesting prefer plants that grow in forest clearings, including those species planted in slashed and burned patches, such as cassava, sugarcane, and coffee. While the anonymous old lady certainly saw her food garden as the final product, directly consumable or marketable, of her agricultural work, the ants perceived it as raw material for their fungus gardens. A mid-19th century polymath named Fortunato Nogueira Penido, from a different province in Brazil, even argued that the leafcutter ants considered human cultivated plants to be, I'm quoting, specially intended for their use, which made Europeans and their descendants mere servants of the ants, including, of course, Nogueira Penido himself. He wrote that he was so hurt that the ants took him as their servant that he declared, I'm quoting, a bloody war against them. Although most pre-colonial indigenous peoples had accommodated the leaf cutters into their lifeways in an organic, if not exactly harmonious way, mainly by moving their villages periodically to escape infestation, mestizo Brazilians tended towards a more recalcitrant and aggressive attitude. But these feelings had already been culturally routinized. Over time, mestizo Brazilians had domesticated their emotions and attitudes towards the Ents by normalizing them as legitimate non-human others. They recognized the Ents as creatures that perceived, evaluated, and acted on the world around them, not just instinctively, but also creatively. There is much evidence of this in the 19th century sources. For example, in their assessment of an ant nest extinction method submitted to a competition in the late 1850s, a committee working for the Society for the Improvement of National Industry rejected a candidate's suggestion that the mere supply of toxic leaves would suffice. They argued that the ants handled biomass input, I'm quoting, with a level of discernment of which only observation can give a complete idea. End of quote. According to the committee, the ants even had epidemiological protocols. Even if some of them happened to die from contact with some unknown toxic body or substance, the survivors, I'm quoting, covered the corpses with earth, isolating them from the rest of the ant hills population. End of quote. This recognition of an intelligent social otherness transformed human transactions with the ants into a genuine interethnic relationship. But playing out across a species boundary as they did, these relations had to deal with a radical parameter of difference, the body. It wasn't just the impossibility of talking to the ants with words. Much more deeply, the problem was that the world of ants, the world they perceived and act upon, is very different from that of people. This subjective world created by species-specific corporeality is what the biologist and philosopher Jacob von Uexküll, forgive my German, called Umwelt. Umwelt. I don't have time, of course, to explore every facet of the ants' Umwelt, but for my purpose here, the most important is to understand how the harvester ants interpret and choose among the available overground plants. Water content, tenderness, perishability, and chemical composition are always important, but never in a context-independent way. The foragers turn up their scent-detecting antenna at the candidate plants, comparing the odors with those released by the material successfully degraded by the fungus. The ants frequently try out new plant species. If unpalatable or toxic elements are not detected on site, the foragers take chunks of the newly encountered resource back to the nest and hand them over to the gardeners, who process them into the fungal substrate. Eventual poisoning is represented by the gardeners through the indexical association between damaged or killed fungus and the plant substrate's odor. And this is fed back to the foragers, probably through chemical signals, who then discontinue the harvesting. So, considering the unbelting of people and leafcutter ants, what is an orange tree like the ones cultivated by the old lady in Azevedo Sampaio's story? For humans, it is a plant whose fruits are directly edible, whereas for the ants, it is a raw material for their underground fungus gardens. The two affordances cannot be brought to fruition at once, at least not to their fullest. That is, considering that the orange tree must remain productive for more than one harvest. To negotiate this conflict, humans use a series of stratagems to convince the ants not to defoliate the orange trees, which resonate through the entire landscape. They place water-filled pots around the trees to prevent the ants from climbing. They plant orange trees interspersed with other species of no economic importance to themselves, but whose leaves the ants appreciate. They translocate nests of other ant species with a known history of conflict with leafcutters near the orange trees. As a last resort, they abandon measures to protect the contested resources to focus on, of course, eliminating the non-human contenders. With greater or lesser success, the ants interpret and deal with all these measures, including eradication attempts. At the same time that our guy Azevedo Sampaio was writing his essay about the old lady, an Austrian scientist named Franz Daffer, the first director of the Campinas Agronomic Institute, commented in a report on the effectiveness of toxic gases against the ants. He said that, I'm quoting, the admirable intelligence of the leafcutters enabled them to reorganize the anthill after the first attack, dividing it into parts that have no correspondence between them, making it almost impossible to circulate the smoke. So, dynamics of this type, in which populations of two different species negotiate the meaning of shared objects that are key to their respective lifeways, configure what I'm calling a multi-species cultural landscape. Okay, the old lady's orchard described by Azevedo Sampaio is one such landscape. Nothing there is natural in the sense of entirely instinctive or pre-programmed. On the contrary, everything is historical, contingent, and potentially creative. Like the stick, for example, the stick that the lady forgot leaning against the fence, and which perceived and interpreted by the ants allowed them to access a new resource. As the geographer Nigel Clark put it, non-human creatures, I'm quoting, refuse to be the raw material that simply precedes culture or falls outside of its range. End of quote. So breaking away from the Saurian tradition, my construct suggests that culture is neither an innate capacity of humans nor something they produce by themselves through incorporeal intellects. Instead, culture is the process by which, generation after generation, populations of different species shape each other's behavior by embodiedly bargaining over the meaning of what stands between them and unites them. Moreover, these interspecies practices help shape rituals and tropes that traditional anthropologists and folklorists used to consider eminently human, right? For example, and going back to the leafcutters one last time, in some regions of Brazil, the female ants called tanajuras in Portuguese, which is borrowed from the Tupi language, the native language. So they would be captured to be transformed into nativity scene characters at Christmas. This was associated with the hunting season for tanajuras, whose nuptial flight occurs in October, with the beginning of the rainy season. Spared from the pan, they are usually, there's a whole recipe to cook the ants. Spared from the pan, some of the captured insects were dressed accordingly. And a shop in São Paulo even specialized in manufacturing them in the late 1800s. At a time when Brazilians, and now I'm talking about specifically the early to mid 20th century, when Brazilians were struggling to create a national identity, the ants also served as a symbolic nemesis, drawing on the routinized antagonism commonly expressed by rural folk. The writer, the fiction writer, Lima Barreto, articulated in the 1910s what would become a powerful proverb in Brazilian nation building. Either we drive out the ants or they will drive us out, right? And this became, just wrapping up, this became something different later on, like either we destroy the ants or they will destroy Brazil, something like that. So the saying was quickly appropriated by formicide manufacturers, polemicists, and politicians. In 1934, the Minister for Agriculture launched a national eradication campaign using a version of the proverb that I would call perspectivist. He said, let us transform ourselves into ants to fight the saúva. One way or another, negotiating the meaning of agricultural landscapes with the ants clearly impacted human mentalities. In this sense, culture is not something humans do to or learn about other beings, but something they do and learn by cultivating difference with these other critters. Thank you so much.